The house at 247 Maple Drive looked like any other on the tree-lined street. White picket fence, neatly trimmed hedges, a welcome mat at the front door. For years, neighbors would wave to the family who lived there, never suspecting that behind those walls, something dark was growing. Something that would eventually shatter the illusion of normalcy and leave a community asking the same haunting question: how could two sons kill their own mother? This is the story of the Henderson brothers and the crime that stunned a quiet suburban town. It's a story about family secrets, psychological wounds that never healed, and the terrifying capacity for violence that can lie dormant in the human heart. Margaret Henderson was 53 years old when she died. To the outside world, she was a dedicated nurse, a woman who had raised two boys on her own after her husband walked out when they were young. She worked double shifts at the county hospital, kept her home immaculate, and attended church every Sunday. Her colleagues described her as competent and professional. Her neighbors knew her as polite but distant. But inside her home, Margaret was someone else entirely. The brothers, Michael and David, were 28 and 26 years old respectively when they committed the act that would define the rest of their lives. Michael, the older brother, had always been the protector. As children, he would position himself between his younger brother and their mother during her episodes of rage. David, more sensitive and introverted, bore the psychological scars more visibly. He dropped out of college after 2 semesters, struggled to maintain relationships, and spent most of his 20s living in his childhood bedroom, unable to escape the gravitational pull of the house on Maple Drive. The murder happened on a Tuesday evening in October. The leaves were beginning to turn, and there was a chill in the air that promised winter was coming. Margaret had just returned from her shift at the hospital. She kicked off her shoes in the entryway, as she always did, and called out to her sons. Neither responded. She walked into the kitchen, expecting to find it empty, expecting to have to yell upstairs for them to come down and eat the dinner she would prepare. But they were waiting for her there. What happened next would be revealed piece by piece over the course of the investigation and trial. The brothers had planned this moment for months. They had discussed it in hushed conversations late at night. They had researched methods, considered timing, debated whether they could actually go through with it. And on that October evening, they decided they could. To understand how two sons could arrive at such a devastating decision, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand what happened in that house over the course of 20 years. We need to examine the nature of abuse, particularly the kind that leaves no visible marks. Margaret Henderson's childhood was marked by instability. Her father was an alcoholic who drifted from job to job. Her mother was passive, withdrawn, unable or unwilling to protect her children from her husband's explosive temper. Margaret learned early that the world was a hostile place, that love was conditional, and that control was the only path to safety. She vowed that her life would be different, that she would be successful, that she would maintain order in her corner of the world. When she married Robert Henderson at 24, she believed she had found stability. Robert was quiet, steady, employed. But Margaret's need for control soon began to suffocate the marriage. She monitored his spending, criticized his choices, dictated how the household should be run. When Michael was born, her focus shifted entirely to the child. Robert became increasingly irrelevant in his own home, a ghost who paid the bills and stayed out of the way. By the time David was born 2 years later, the marriage was already crumbling. Robert had begun staying late at work, finding excuses to be anywhere but home. Margaret's resentment grew. She felt abandoned, overwhelmed, convinced that she was the only one holding the family together. When Robert finally left for good, when David was just 4 years old, Margaret's worst fears seemed confirmed. She had been right all along. People leave, people disappoint, people fail you. From that point forward, Margaret's relationship with her sons took on a different quality. They became not just her children, but her possessions, extensions of herself, proof of her worth. She expected perfection because anything less was a reflection of her failure. She demanded obedience because chaos terrified her. And when they fell short, which children inevitably do, her rage was swift and terrible. The abuse was never physical in the traditional sense. Margaret never hit her sons with her fists or left bruises that teachers might notice. Instead, she used words as weapons. She told Michael he was stupid when he brought home a B instead of an A. She told David he was weak when he cried. She withheld affection and approval, doling it out only when they met her exacting standards, which were always shifting, always impossible to predict. She had other methods too. Silent treatment that lasted for days. Sudden explosions of anger over minor infractions. A look that could freeze a child in place. She would throw things, not at them, but near them. A plate that shattered against the wall. A book that flew across the room. The message was clear. This could be you. I am barely containing this rage, and it is your fault for provoking it. Psychologists have a term for this kind of treatment: emotional abuse. It's insidious because it's invisible. There are no broken bones to document, no emergency room visits to raise red flags. The damage accumulates internally, in the architecture of the developing brain, in the child's sense of self-worth, in their understanding of what love means. Michael and David learned to read their mother's moods with exquisite precision. They learned to stay quiet, to stay out of sight, to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. They learned that their own feelings didn't matter, that expressing needs was dangerous, that the only way to survive was to make themselves small. As they grew older, the dynamic intensified. Margaret's expectations didn't decrease as they matured, they multiplied. Michael was expected to excel academically, to get a scholarship, to become successful enough to vindicate all her sacrifices. David was expected to be grateful, compliant, a living testament to her superior parenting. Neither boy could ever do enough. Michael tried to leave after high school. He got into a state university 3 hours away and felt, for the first time, a glimmer of hope. But Margaret sabotaged his plans in subtle ways. She developed mysterious health problems that required his help. She called constantly, crying about how alone she was, how worried she was about David. She made him feel guilty for wanting independence, for wanting a life of his own. Eventually, Michael transferred to a community college closer to home and moved back into his childhood bedroom. The brothers' bond was forged in shared suffering. They had an unspoken understanding, a wordless language developed over years of surviving together. Michael had always tried to shield David from the worst of their mother's rages, but as they grew older, that became impossible. They were both trapped in different ways. David never really tried to leave. The prospect of the outside world terrified him more than staying did. He had been so thoroughly conditioned to believe he was incapable, so convinced of his own inadequacy, that the idea of independence seemed absurd. He worked part-time jobs that went nowhere, spent hours online, retreated into video games and fantasy worlds where he had control, where his choices mattered. Michael, meanwhile, maintained a facade of normalcy. He got a job in IT, earned enough to afford his own place, but never actually moved out. He told himself he was staying to protect David, to be there in case things got bad. But the truth was more complicated. Part of him was still that little boy desperate for his mother's approval. Part of him couldn't imagine abandoning his brother. And part of him had been so thoroughly shaped by that house that leaving felt impossible, like trying to escape gravity. The years passed. Michael dated occasionally but never let anyone get close enough to see the truth of his family's situation. David had no relationships at all. Margaret continued her routine: work, home, church, maintaining the appearance of respectability while behind closed doors. The psychological warfare continued. The turning point came slowly. then all at once. It wasn't a single dramatic incident, but an accumulation of moments. A particularly vicious argument where Margaret told David he was worthless and would never amount to anything. A night when she destroyed something precious to Michael, a gift from a friend, simply because she was angry and it was within reach. The gradual realization between the brothers that this would never end, that she would never change, that they would spend the rest of their lives in this prison unless they did something drastic. The idea first emerged during a late-night conversation. David said it first, almost as a joke, almost testing the waters. "Sometimes I wish she would just die." Michael didn't respond immediately, but he didn't reject the notion either. Instead, there was a long silence, heavy with possibility. Over the following weeks, they began to talk more openly about it. What would life be like without her? Could they actually be free? At first, they framed it hypothetically. They weren't really planning anything. They were just talking, just imagining. But gradually, the conversations became more specific, more concrete. Michael, with his methodical mind, began researching. He looked up cases where children had killed parents, trying to understand how they had been caught, what mistakes they had made. He researched methods that would appear natural, that might not trigger an immediate investigation. He thought about timing, about alibis, about the practical logistics of murder. David was more emotional in his approach. For him, it wasn't about careful planning. It was about release, about escape, about finally making the pain stop. He swung between desperate conviction and paralyzing doubt. Could they really do this? Were they capable of killing another human being, even one who had caused them so much suffering? The brothers understood that what they were contemplating was monstrous. They weren't delusional. They knew that society, the law, perhaps even they themselves, would judge them as murderers, as monsters. But they had reached a point where that seemed preferable to continuing as they were. The calculus had shifted. The prospect of life in prison seemed less horrific than another decade in that house. They chose a method that Michael believed would work: suffocation. It could potentially be mistaken for a medical episode, especially in a woman her age with high stress levels from her demanding job. They planned to do it while she slept, to minimize struggle, to make it as quick as possible. They told themselves they weren't sadists, that they didn't want her to suffer, that this was simply necessary. In the weeks before the murder, both brothers exhibited signs of extreme stress. Michael developed insomnia, lost weight, became irritable at work. David withdrew even further, spending entire days in his room, barely eating. If anyone had been paying close attention, if either of them had had close friends or confidants, someone might have noticed that something was wrong. But they had successfully isolated themselves, or been isolated, for so long that there was no one to see the warning signs. On the day of the murder, both brothers called in sick to their respective jobs. They spent the day in a strange state of suspended animation, moving through the house like ghosts, barely speaking to each other, certainly not speaking to their mother. Margaret herself seemed to sense something was off. She asked several times if they were all right, if something was wrong. They assured her everything was fine. That evening, Margaret went to bed at her usual time, around 10:30. The brothers waited. They sat in the living room, in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house settling, to their mother moving around upstairs, to the eventual silence that indicated she had fallen asleep. At midnight, they looked at each other. Michael stood first. David followed. They climbed the stairs to their mother's bedroom. Each step felt both endless and too quick. When they reached her door, Michael paused, his hand on the knob. This was the moment. After this, there would be no going back. David stood behind him, shaking but resolute. Michael opened the door. What happened next would be described in clinical detail during the trial, but here we can spare the specifics. It's enough to say that Margaret woke during the attack, that she struggled, that she tried to call out, to ask why, to beg, that it took longer than the brothers had anticipated, that it was messy and terrible, and nothing like the clean, quick release they had imagined. When it was over, when Margaret Henderson was dead, the brothers stood in that bedroom in shock. David was crying. Michael was methodical, already thinking about what came next, how to stage the scene, what to tell the police when they were inevitably called. But beneath his calculated exterior, he too was shattered by what they had done. They called 911 at 6 in the morning, claiming they had found their mother unresponsive in bed. The operator dispatched emergency services immediately. When the paramedics arrived, they were met by two distraught sons, who appeared to have just discovered their mother's body. The initial assessment suggested possible cardiac arrest or stroke. Margaret's body was transported to the hospital, where she was officially pronounced dead. But something didn't sit right with the responding officers. The brothers' grief seemed performative. There were small inconsistencies in their accounts of the morning. The bedroom scene felt staged in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. An autopsy was ordered. The medical examiner found signs of asphyxiation, petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, minor bruising around the nose and mouth, evidence that suggested this had not been a natural death. The police returned to the Henderson home with new questions and growing suspicions. Under interrogation, the brothers' story began to crumble. David broke first. The guilt, the horror of what they had done, the accumulated trauma of a lifetime, it all came pouring out. He confessed in a rambling, incoherent statement that took hours to complete. He detailed the planning, the execution, the years of abuse that had led them to this point. Michael tried to recant David's confession, to claim his brother was mentally unstable, that he was fabricating. But the physical evidence supported David's account. And when confronted with the reality that they would both be charged, Michael too began to talk. His confession was more controlled, more detailed. He tried to explain, to make the investigators understand what it had been like living with Margaret Henderson, to make them see that this wasn't simple murder, but something more complicated. The trial attracted significant media attention. It had all the elements of a compelling story: family dysfunction, psychological abuse, fraternal loyalty, and the fundamental question of how much suffering justifies violence. The prosecution argued that regardless of what the brothers had endured, murder was never justifiable, that they could have left, could have sought help, could have made different choices. The defense painted a picture of two profoundly damaged men who had been systematically destroyed by their mother over decades. They brought in psychologists who testified about complex post-traumatic stress disorder, about learned helplessness, about the ways childhood abuse can warp development and perception. They argued that the brothers' capacity for rational decision-making had been severely compromised. The jury heard testimony from former teachers who remembered Michael and David as anxious, withdrawn children. They heard from a neighbor who recalled once seeing Margaret scream at young David for tracking mud into the house, her face contorted with rage disproportionate to the offense. They heard from Michael's former girlfriend, who described his inability to discuss his family, the way he would shut down if she asked too many questions. But they also heard from Margaret's colleagues, who insisted she was a dedicated professional, from church members who knew her as a devout woman, from people who had never seen any evidence of the monster the defense described. This was the paradox of Margaret Henderson. She was capable of maintaining a perfectly acceptable public persona while being someone entirely different in private. The prosecution made a compelling case that the brothers had other options. They were adults. They could have moved out, severed contact, built lives elsewhere. The fact that they felt unable to do so didn't give them the right to take a life. The law exists precisely to prevent people from taking justice into their own hands, to provide civilized alternatives to violence. The defense countered that the brothers' situation was not so simple. Psychological abuse is as real, and as damaging as physical abuse, though society is often slower to recognize it. The brothers had been conditioned from childhood to believe they were helpless, that they deserved their treatment, that they had no right to needs or boundaries of their own. From their perspective, trapped in a psychological cage of their mother's making, murder had seemed like the only escape. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They found both brothers guilty of first-degree murder, but recommended consideration of mitigating circumstances during sentencing. The judge gave Michael 30 years to life. David received 25 years to life, with the court noting his psychological vulnerabilities and his brother's dominant role in planning the crime. In the years since the trial, the Henderson case has been debated by legal scholars, psychologists, and ethicists. It raises profound questions about justice, about personal responsibility, about the long-term effects of abuse, and about where society's sympathy should lie. Some argue that the brothers were victims who became victimizers, that their crime, while legally murder, was morally more ambiguous. They point to the extensive documentation of psychological abuse, to the brothers' obvious trauma, to the failure of any system to intervene before tragedy struck. They see the brothers as casualties of a society that still doesn't take emotional abuse seriously enough. Others maintain that sympathy for the brothers' suffering cannot override the fundamental wrongness of their act. Margaret Henderson, whatever her flaws as a mother, did not deserve to die. She was strangled in her own bed by the children she had raised. The brothers had alternatives, however difficult those alternatives might have been. They chose murder, and murder demands accountability. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in the complicated middle ground. The brothers were both victims and perpetrators. Their suffering was real, and it shaped them in profound ways. But suffering, no matter how intense, does not provide moral license to kill. They made a choice, and that choice had consequences that rippled outward, destroying lives and traumatizing a community. In prison, the brothers have followed different paths. Michael has been a model inmate, working in the prison library, taking correspondence courses, maintaining a strict routine. Those who know him describe a man still controlled, still careful, still trying to maintain order in his environment. He has expressed remorse for the murder, though he has also been clear in interviews that he doesn't entirely regret freeing himself and his brother from their mother. David has struggled more. He has been in and out of psychiatric care, dealing with depression and PTSD symptoms that intensified after the murder. For him, the guilt is crushing. He has attempted suicide twice and spends much of his time isolated from the general population. In a letter written to a journalist several years into his sentence, he wrote, "I thought killing her would make me free, but I've never been more trapped. I see her face every night. I hear her voice. I don't know if I'll ever escape her, even though she's dead." The house on Maple Drive was sold to settle Margaret's estate. A young family lives there now, unaware of its history. The neighbors who remember the Hendersons rarely speak of them. There's a sense in the community that what happened was an aberration, something that couldn't happen again, something best forgotten. But forgetting doesn't prevent recurrence. Only understanding does. Experts estimate that millions of children grow up in psychologically abusive homes. Most of them don't become murderers. Most find ways to survive, to heal, to build lives despite their early trauma. But some don't. Some remain so damaged, so trapped, that they make desperate choices. The Henderson brothers represent the extreme end of this spectrum, but they're not entirely anomalous. They're a warning sign. What could have prevented this tragedy? The answers are both simple and impossibly complex. Better identification of psychological abuse, more resources for children and adults in emotionally toxic family situations, a society that takes invisible wounds as seriously as visible ones, education about healthy relationships and the long-term effects of emotional maltreatment. But these systemic changes, while necessary, wouldn't have reached into the specific darkness of the Henderson home. The family's isolation was too complete. Margaret's public persona was too convincing. The brothers' fear and shame ran too deep. Intervention would have required someone close enough to see the truth and brave enough to act on it, and there was no such person in their lives. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this case is its ordinariness. From the outside, the Hendersons looked like countless other families. Slightly dysfunctional perhaps, but nothing extraordinary. The house didn't stand out. The family members were unremarkable. There were no obvious warning signs that would have predicted such a violent conclusion. This is what makes the case so unsettling. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. The question of whether the brothers deserved the sentences they received remains contested. Some believe they should have received lighter sentences, that the court should have recognized them primarily as abuse survivors rather than as murderers. Others believe they got off lightly, that life without parole would have been more appropriate. The justice system tried to balance punishment with understanding, but in cases this complicated, perfect balance is impossible. Michael Henderson will be eligible for parole in 2040. He will be 58 years old, having spent 30 years behind bars. David will be eligible in 2045 at age 57. Whether either will be released depends on numerous factors: their behavior in prison, their psychological evaluations, the parole board's assessment of their danger to society. Even if released, they will carry the weight of their crime for the rest of their lives. In rare interviews, Michael has spoken about that October night with a strange detachment. He describes it almost clinically, as if discussing someone else's actions. "We believe we had no choice," he has said. "I know now that there were choices. There are always choices. But at the time, we couldn't see them. We were too far gone, too damaged. We could only see one way out." David has been less willing to discuss specifics, but in that letter to the journalist, he wrote something that captures the terrible tragedy of this case. "People ask if I'm sorry. Of course I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. For killing her. For not killing her sooner. For not finding another way. For being born into that family at all. I'm sorry for existing. But being sorry doesn't change anything. She's still dead. We're still here. And I still don't know if what we did was right or wrong. I don't think I'll ever know." This moral ambiguity is perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Henderson case. It challenges our comfortable categories of victim and perpetrator, right and wrong. It forces us to confront the reality that people can be multiple things simultaneously: abused and abusive, sympathetic and monstrous, victims of circumstance and agents of terrible violence. The psychological community has studied this case extensively, using it to better understand the long-term effects of emotional abuse and the circumstances under which victims might become violent. Dr. Sarah Chin, a clinical psychologist who has worked with survivors of family abuse, notes that the Henderson brothers represent a rare but significant subset of abuse survivors, those for whom the trauma is so profound and the sense of entrapment so complete that violence seems rational. "Most abuse survivors internalize their pain," Dr. Chin explains. "They harm themselves rather than their abusers. They develop depression, anxiety, substance abuse issues. They struggle with relationships and self-worth, but a small percentage externalize instead. They reach a breaking point where survival instinct overrides moral conditioning. The Henderson brothers reached that point, and the result was catastrophic. This doesn't excuse their actions, Dr. Chin is quick to note, but it does contextualize them. Understanding why people commit terrible acts is not the same as justifying those acts. But without understanding, prevention is impossible. If we can identify the warning signs earlier, if we can reach children in abusive homes before the damage becomes irreparable, we might prevent future tragedies. The Henderson case has influenced legal discussions about what constitutes self-defense, and whether psychological abuse should be considered equivalent to physical abuse in the eyes of the law. Some jurisdictions have begun to recognize long-term emotional abuse as grounds for mitigating circumstances in assault and homicide cases. The law is slowly catching up to what psychologists have long understood, that the mind can be wounded as severely as the body, and that those wounds can drive desperate actions. For the community of Maple Drive and the surrounding neighborhoods, the Henderson case shattered assumptions about the nature of family. Neighbors began to look at other households differently, wondering what might be happening behind closed doors. Some became more vigilant, more willing to report concerns about children's welfare. Others became more paranoid, seeing potential danger everywhere. The local schools implemented new training for teachers on recognizing signs of emotional abuse. The police department revised its protocols for domestic disturbance calls to include questions about verbal and psychological abuse, not just physical violence. These were small changes, but they represented a shift in awareness. One of Margaret's colleagues at the hospital, a nurse named Patricia Knowles, has spoken publicly about her guilt. "I worked with Margaret for 15 years, she said in a television interview. "I never suspected anything was wrong at home. She seemed so normal, so professional. Now I wonder if there were signs I missed. Little things she said about her sons, ways she talked about control and discipline. I keep thinking, could I have done something? Could I have seen this coming?" This question haunts many people connected to the case. Could anyone have intervened? Were there missed opportunities? The honest answer is probably yes. There are always missed opportunities in cases like this, but recognizing them requires a level of awareness and courage that is rare. It requires looking beyond surface appearances and being willing to act on suspicions that might turn out to be wrong. The media coverage of the trial revealed society's divided sympathies. Some outlets portrayed the brothers as cold-blooded killers who murdered their mother for her life insurance money, a motive the prosecution suggested but never proved. Others painted them as tortured souls who finally snapped after years of abuse. Both narratives were too simple, too neat. The reality was messier, more human, more tragic. True crime podcasts and documentary series have examined the case, each with its own angle. Some focus on the psychology of familial murder. Others explore the nature of emotional abuse. A few have attempted to reconstruct Margaret's perspective, to understand what drove her to treat her children the way she did. These explorations reveal a woman who was herself damaged, who replicated patterns of control and criticism that she had experienced in her own childhood. She was part of a cycle of pain that stretched back generations. This generational trauma aspect adds another layer of complexity. Margaret was not simply a monster. She was a person shaped by her own experiences, employing survival strategies that had helped her navigate a difficult childhood, but that became toxic when applied to parenting. This doesn't absolve her, but it does humanize her. It reminds us that cruelty often emerges from pain, that people who hurt others are often themselves deeply hurt. The Henderson case forces us to hold multiple truths simultaneously: that Margaret was abusive, and that she was a victim of her own upbringing. That the brothers suffered genuine trauma, and that they committed murder. That understanding the causes of violence doesn't mean excusing it. That sympathy and accountability must coexist. As the years pass and the immediate shock of the case fades, what remains is a complicated story about family, love, damage, and choice. The Henderson brothers will spend decades in prison, paying the price for their decision. Margaret Henderson is dead, denied any opportunity for change or redemption. And a community continues to grapple with what happened and what it means. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson from this tragedy is the most obvious: that families are complex systems where patterns established early can echo across decades, that help must come before crisis, that silence protects no one. The brothers' silence about their abuse allowed it to continue until violence seemed like the only language available. Had they been able to speak earlier, to find help, to escape through means other than murder, 3 lives might have been saved. But they couldn't speak, because they had been taught from earliest childhood that their voices didn't matter, that their pain was irrelevant, that they existed only to fulfill their mother's needs. Breaking that conditioning takes more than willpower. It takes intervention, support, resources, and often luck. The Henderson brothers had none of these things. So they planned. They executed their plan. They destroyed their lives in the process of ending their mothers. And now they exist in a kind of limbo, neither fully guilty nor fully innocent in their own minds, forever caught between the trauma that shaped them and the choice that defined them. This is the story of the Henderson brothers. It's a story without heroes, without clear moral lines, without easy answers. It's a story that challenges us to think more deeply about family, about abuse, about justice, and about the invisible wounds that sometimes explode into visible violence. It's a story that reminds us that behind every crime, there are human beings, flawed, damaged, sometimes monstrous, but always human. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable truth of all, that under the right circumstances, shaped by the right pressures, anyone might be capable of the unthinkable. The Henderson brothers are not aliens. They're not incomprehensible. They're what happens when pain meets desperation, when trauma meets opportunity, when silence lasts too long. They're a warning. And we ignore that warning at our own peril.